time for the Locked on the Gamecocks podcast with Keith Allsep and JC Shurburtt.
Welcome in to the second episode of the Locked on the Gamecocks podcast. I am JC Shurburtt, and bringing in my partner in crime, Keith Allsep here, for another edition of what is quickly becoming one of the most popular podcasts on the South Carolina Gamecocks on the World Wide Web. Keith, how you doing tonight, buddy?
JC, I'm doing great. How are you? It's a very eventful weekend for the Gamecocks.
No doubt. Of course, South Carolina on the recruiting trail held their Spurs Up cookout. It's the second cookout type event that they've held, and these are very popular. And actually, the Spurrier staff toward the end had, a pretty good feedback when they had events like this. They didn't always do it, but when they did, it was pretty good. They hold it at the Strom Thurmond facility up there on campus at USC, which has a pool and things of that nature. And it's kind of the style of event, sort of like they do at Auburn and Florida, with these types of social gatherings rather than a camp where you're going to kind of work out and things like that. Second one that they've had, and for the second time, the returns have been fantastic. South Carolina got a commitment first and foremost on Saturday from the safety from Clark Central, who actually committed to the Gamecocks back a month ago and then held off and wanted to wait to announce it after this event, and he did. And then they got another commitment from linebacker Sherrod Green from Rocky Mount, North Carolina. 6'1", 220-pound guy. Had lots of pretty extensive offer list. Picked the Gamecocks at the end of the day over NC State. Really good film, a big physical guy that could, emerge as a starter or I think early in his career. So what do you think about the two commits first, and then we'll get into some of the other guys that South Carolina's really established some momentum with?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm really impressed with Sherrod Green with his film. I watched his film again over the weekend, and I guess we found out, JC, he came in on Saturday and then actually stayed over until Sunday along with another potential or a big-time Gamecock target and hopefully future commit in Jemias Williams. And those guys were at the opening together out in Oregon. And to me, Sherrod Green, his film was very reminiscent of a couple of linebackers that played on Charlie Strong's defense at South Carolina, Shannon, the body bag Wadley, and Kenny Harney, who's from down in Allendale, Fairfax. Both big hitters with really good instincts and very productive players. And I think Sherrod Green did have an offer from Alabama. I don't know if that was committable or not, but I know he took a visit down there, and him being a kid that was at the opening, I thought that was very impressive. And then, of course, I think it's been about the worst-kept secret on the Gamecock message boards that Zay Brown would be a commitment. And he's probably an under-the-radar prospect, but, JC, one thing that we really didn't mention last week was about a number of the commitments that Coach Muschamp has taken this summer from three-star prospects who may have been a little under the radar. They've used this brand-new indoor practice facility to set up essentially a combine circuit where those kids come in, they measure them, they weigh them, they time them in the 40, they check their vertical leap, they time their shuttle, and measure their standing broad jump. And there are a number of coaches there that are watching them go through that. And then they put them through position-specific drills. And so I think that's where the evaluation process really comes in. And not only that, they get to judge the players as competitors. They're coaching them hard. And I think on kids like that, you should have a very high hit rate. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. And Zay Brown, of course, is one of several defensive backs that they've evaluated in person during the camps this summer. 6 foot, 180 pounds. Looking at his pictures, he looks a little bigger than that. Looks a little more filled out. From what I've been told, he's a hardworking kid. He's a guy that could really be a high-level SEC player in time. Of course, the question's always going to be for an Athens kid, why didn't Georgia recruit him? But I'll remind you that Georgia didn't recruit Dante Robinson either, and didn't recruit Carl Platt, who was a wide receiver, I think, back in the 80s from Clark Central. South Carolina actually has had success if you look at the sample size of the guys they've gotten out of Athens. 2 of the 3 that I know of have ended up pretty good, Marte Maddox being the exception that was during the Spurrier era. I agree with you there. I think that evaluations, when you're in a position like Muschamp and staff are right now, when you're 3-9, when you're trying to establish momentum, you can do recruiting one of several different ways. And, one of the best ways to do it when you're not ultra popular is to out-evaluate everybody else and get guys that can run, that have athleticism, that you've put through tests and that you've seen in person, and then trust your eyes. And that's the thing. I mean, if I'm going to miss, I'm going to miss with quick twitch athleticism.
I agree.
And that's kind of what I think the philosophy has been, particularly in the secondary where South Carolina needs all the help it can get, and if you can combine the group they have now with the Jemias Williams, maybe a Yusuf Corker, Trajan Bandy from a 4-star that just decommitted from Oklahoma. A lot of those guys are no-brainer types. And you need some no-brainer types. So if you get some no-brainer types along with the evaluations, that creates competition in your secondary, and I think turns that spot around really, really quick. I mean, that's one of the most inexcusable things I think about, besides wide receiver, that happened at the end of the Spurrier era. You're talking about a program that Jonathan Joseph graduated from, that Sheldon Brown, Andre Goodman, Willie Offord came out of, Stephon Gilmore, Devontae Holloman, Co Simpson, Antonio Allen. I mean, the list goes on of very good South Carolina defensive backs, since 2000 out of that program. And, to see kind of the situation in the secondary now, I think it's just kind of one of those shocking things. And I'll tell you where they messed up, Keith, is they started, when Ellis Johnson left, Lorenzo Ward started putting a premium on finding the next Stephon Gilmore. And he started going and getting these guys that, yes, they had height, but they couldn't run, and they couldn't move their hips, and they weren't athletic, and they weren't explosive. And that will get you killed in the SEC at cornerback. I mean,
no doubt.
I've seen a lot of 5'9" corners that can run and are explosive and can play ball have success in college football and on the NFL. I have yet to see a guy that's 6'1" that cannot run play corner at a high level. And, in fact, I've rarely seen it where this guy is not a liability. And I think that's a mistake a lot of coaches make.
Well, I agree. I think there's a couple of guys you can bring up right off the bat. Vernon Hargraves Jr., Janoris Jenkins. I can even go one better. I can go back in the day to Tim Jennings, who was going to South Carolina State until Georgia missed on a guy late, and they took him. Of course, the rest is history. And he was a guy, I was at that Shrine Bowl that year, and that was a guy that went toe-to-toe with Troy Williamson, Fred Bennett, and there was a receiver,
Kelvin Grant.
Kelvin Grant. And those guys won 0 reps against Tim Jennings. And I was begging Skip Holtz to take him at the Shrine Bowl. And he was like, oh, he's a peanut. We got Rasheem Monroe. I'm like, Rasheem Monroe? Rasheem Monroe? Rasheem Monroe is not Tim Jennings. But anyway, getting back to some more relevant information, Jemias Williams, I think, pound for pound, could be the best cover corner in the country. We talked about it last week. This guy is just a special athlete, and he is exactly what you dialed up when you said quick twitch, explosive athlete. And this guy is really impressive. And I mean, for whatever reason, it looks like Clemson wants a bigger corner, an A.J. Terrell type. Georgia may be looking for a bigger corner, and it looks like this kid could drop right in South Carolina's lap. And it's a great testament to Will Muschamp and Travaris Robinson. And I think their track record of putting DBs in the NFL speaks for itself. So that's looking good. One thing I saw yesterday was Jamias Williams was quoted as saying, "Hey, man, if me and Trajan Bandy, if we team up at South Carolina, man, it's going to be trouble." And so, then Bandy was quoted as saying, what if he and Jamias Williams go to the same school? So there could be some good karma going on there with those guys looking to team up and really be a pair of lockdown SEC corners for the Gamecocks.
Yeah, and with Bandy, they have to beat Miami. I don't think that kid's going to Oklahoma. I think if he was going to recommit to the Sooners and go to Oklahoma, he would have never decommitted. I think it's a South Carolina-Miami battle. You just got to get him to leave home if you're the Gamecocks. And that's a 50-50 proposition at times. But he's proven if he's going to commit to Oklahoma and go that far from home, then, South Carolina certainly is not as far. And certainly, Travaris Robinson has a lot of connections in Miami. The Gamecocks have Chris Lamons and Rashad Fenton on their roster from South Florida.
And Kier
Thomas. I mean, there are a lot of guys from that area that and that's good. I mean, because you can go take as many corners and receivers and safeties as you possibly can from South Florida because there's a lot of them, and they're all good. So,
no question.
I think that it's a positive thing if they can get Bandy, and that would kind of build up the secondary, and quite frankly, I think South Carolina could take 5 or 6 at that spot. So
I agree. So, JC, there's one guy I wanted to ask you about. Now, would not be a rare thing for a guy that's committed to South Carolina to flip to Alabama. But there's a guy, Aaron Sterling, defensive end from Stevenson High School, which the Gamecocks have had, they've taken a lot of guys from there. Mike Davis, predominantly the guy from that school. But last year, South Carolina took DJ Wonnum, who's a defensive end that evidently is very good friends with Aaron Sterling. This guy's a 4-star player. He's committed to Alabama, and he's visited South Carolina for the second time, and there's some rumblings that a flip could be in the works here. Now, explain to me how that's going to happen.
I have no idea other than South Carolina does have some connections at Stevenson. This kid committed to Alabama on December the 25th of 2015, this past December. So he kind of got in the boat early. 6'2", 260, kind of a tweener size-wise. Maybe a guy that Alabama will take but is backing off of. Maybe a guy that, just thinks maybe his playing time would be better at South Carolina. I don't know. I don't know that flip's going to happen, but I can't rule it out either. It's one of those things that's kind of flown under the radar, but it wouldn't surprise me. And, with DJ Wonnum, too, he's got a brother that's a class of 2018 offensive tackle who's a 4-star kid and already has 10, 15 offers. So, with Stevenson guys, and that's one thing Lorenzo Ward did a good job of, is he kind of got a pipeline into there. South Carolina is a known school at that high school. Muschamp was able to get in there and get Wonnum late last year, flipping from Indiana. So I don't know. Will this be the latest flip by the flipper? Certainly there's a recent history there with him flipping Wonnum, even though he was only committed to Indiana for a day and he flipped him the next day. I mean, that's still a flip, still counts. So we'll see what happens. I like Sterling. I think, he's a guy that could play in. He's one of those versatile defensive linemen, could play inside, could play outside. And
now, JC, is he a similar type guy to MJ Webb?
I wouldn't think so because Sterling's a little shorter than MJ listed and a little lighter. He's probably built a little more squatty. MJ Webb, what I really like about him, this kid's 6'3.5", has really long arms. He's 270. So he's built more like a big end than a guy that you grow into a tackle, if that makes any sense. So I like Webb a little better between the two. But I like Aaron Sterling for who he is. And, heck, I would take both of them, honestly.
Well, JC, seems one guy that nobody talks about in the state of South Carolina is Brad Johnson from Pendleton. This is a guy that's growing up in the shadow of Death Valley up there. He's reports are he maybe had hit a little growth spurt this summer, maybe 6'4", 230. I know going into summer he was about 6'3", 225, and he's a track guy. And he is picture perfect for that buck position because you know he's going to grow. I mean, Travian Robertson was 6'3", 225 when he enrolled at South Carolina, and about 12 weeks later he was 257 pounds. So we know this guy is going to get bigger. And he was on campus again, and it looks like he's going to be making a fall decision. How do you feel about the Gamecocks' chances with Brad Johnson, and just kind of break down what kind of a player you envision him being if he indeed commits to South Carolina?
Well, Johnson's a good pass rusher. I think that as far as his recruitment is concerned, I think he's a little more open than people think. I don't think he's a layup for the Gamecocks, even though all the crystal ball predictions are for South Carolina. I don't know where else he would go, though. There's the number 2 school right now. I can't put my finger on it. You know, who knows where it will be. But I know he's the number 1 guy at the buck position that they have right now that they're looking at, because they've talked in terms of, you know, from what I've heard, you know, they've been discussing things in terms of if they don't get Johnson, there's these guys are the backup plans, that type of thing. So they want Brad Johnson, and I think they got a good chance to get him. South Carolina, has recruited him hard from the day they've got there. As far as the type of player he is, he's a pass rusher. I mean, he's a guy that's got really good pass rushing skills. Saw him at camp last summer at South Carolina. Didn't look very good. But then the film, which is the most important thing, for his junior year was excellent. And if he's gotten bigger and he can still rush the passer, which I have no doubt that he'll be able to do, I think he's become a priority recruit for the Gamecocks. And even though he's got 3 little stars by his name, he's a player that South Carolina probably does not want to lose. I mean, he is a quick twitch athlete. He is a guy that can get out there and get it done in the pass rushing department.
All right, that sounds good. And so another defensive end that was in for the Spurs Up event this weekend from a very familiar high school, Garner High School, produced Chris Culliver and
Reggie Bowens,
linebacker that really had an excellent senior year for the Gamecocks, played well as a junior, but kind of was bitten with injuries early in his career. Butler's a big end. Could grow into a tackle maybe. 6'4", 255. What are your thoughts on him? And what seems to be a lot of crystal ball picks trending towards the Gamecocks now with Butler.
He told us after he visited on Saturday that South Carolina was definitely up near the top or at the top. He said his parents were comfortable with South Carolina. A guy that is he's kind of like some of those defensive linemen they took last year, the Aaron Thompsons of the world. Maybe a little Griffin Gentry in there too. A guy big end could grow into a tackle. And then people have to understand that's going to be the type of guy that they target a lot of times on the defensive line, because they will run a lot of 3-man front, and you need big ends and a big guy in the middle. Now, it's not the traditional 3-man, straight 3-4 that a lot of teams run. It's kind of an unbalanced set, and they like to move guys around and things like that. So, these types of guys, keep in mind, Sharif Floyd played defensive end at Florida for Will Muschamp before going on to the NFL and playing defensive tackle. They will move guys, big guys on the end. They'll do that to kind of set the point of attack. he's another type of guy that I think they like, that Lance Thompson can definitely develop. You watch his film, he gets off the ball quickly. He's athletic. North Carolina is defensive line heaven. So, you look at guys up there that play defensive line, there's a lot of them just about every year, and a lot of them probably don't get the exposure that they deserve or need. But a lot of them end up being pretty doggone good. And I think Matthew Butler could be very good, and he'd be a very good pickup for South Carolina. And right now I think the Gamecocks are trending.
All right, so what about playmakers? Now, I don't think last week we talked about Tyson Williams, who is transferring in from UNC, who was a big-time four-star recruit that really the previous staff didn't do a very good job of recruiting, so he went to North Carolina and was an early enrollee there, had a very encouraging spring practice. But, JC, North Carolina, outside of Alabama, may have been one of the most loaded teams in the country at the running back position. He really couldn't get on the field and decided to transfer and wanted to come back home. And because when this kid's a redshirt senior in 2019, Larry Fedora, who probably will not be at North Carolina in 2019, said, well, we're not going to release you. So his mom, his parents are in the military, and they're going to pay for his transfer year this coming year off the GI Bill. I mean, wow, I don't even know what to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, these transfer situations get iffy. I know this. I know the North Carolina coaches were surprised at how good he was when they got him. They thought they really got a guy that could be a special player. They've done a good job of not only recruiting at running back, but getting different types of backs. You got Elijah Hood, who's a power guy who has speed, your workhorse. Tyson Williams is a workhorse, so he wasn't going to really get on the field with Elijah Hood there. And then you had TJ Logan, who's kind of your speed back. And then Romar Morris, who's a very fast guy as well, who clocks at 4.4, who's had to learn kind of how to play the position. You have him too. And plus the fact that North Carolina last year ran the quarterback, Marquise Williams, a whole bunch and threw the ball a whole bunch. So there really wasn't an opportunity, for a true freshman running back to get on the field up there. And South Carolina was, the team to beat for him. The Gamecock coaches at the time could have held off Mon Denson, who I don't think had many other offers, or let him go to Arkansas, for a week or so or 2 weeks, because they dropped him. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, he commits to North Carolina and enrolls early. I mean, that could have changed the trajectory of last season in a lot of ways because, David Williams was struggling. Sean Carson actually played well when he got an opportunity. And Brandon Wilds, once again, went through a season and couldn't stay healthy. So if you'd had this kid last year, maybe the run game's a little bit different. Maybe you have an opportunity. Of course, I have zero faith that the running backs coach at the time would have put this guy in. So there's that too. But I think that him coming back to South Carolina is huge because what it essentially is South Carolina's getting another 2017 running back for the class of 2017 to go along with Keyshawn Bryan out of St. Thomas Aquinas. And that's a good, solid duo of running backs for Bobby Bentley to work with. I know they're high on A.J. Turner, who's a redshirt freshman, as kind of a speed back. They're high on Rico Dowdle, who'll be a true freshman coming in. David Williams still has another year. C.J. Freeman is a true freshman who will probably redshirt. We'll see what happens with him. We'll see what happens with Denson. But then you got these two guys coming in next year. And I think that just kind of solidifies it and gets depth back at that spot that's sort of going to be missing this season. South Carolina will be deeper at running back. And I think Tyson Williams could, win the starting job, in 2017. He is that good of a player. He's, 5'9", around 200 pounds, 210, I think, probably heavier by now. Runs a 4.5, is shifty, can run for power, can make people miss, not afraid at all, gets north and south. I mean, he's a guy that can have a really good career at South Carolina.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if the day he sets foot on campus, either he or Rico Dowdle could be the most talented backs on the roster. So Gamecocks had in the number one prospect in the state, wide receiver Ortre Smith, big kid, 6'4", 200-plus pounds from Mount Pleasant. As we all know by now, his mom played volleyball at Clemson, but it seemed for a while early Clemson wasn't going to take him, and Will Muschamp has personally recruited this kid and made him a priority along with Brian McClendon. Clemson already has a couple of high-profile commitments, and Smith's winding it down. He was back at South Carolina over the weekend. What are the boots on the ground saying, JC?
Yeah, I think South Carolina feels comfortable with their position with him right now. I just think with the momentum Clemson has as a program, people logically think, well, he's a legacy and he'll probably go there. But the question is, how hard have they been recruiting him? Not as hard as South Carolina. And I say that, and I don't want to offend any Clemson people, but, Clemson has priorities. They've got guys out there. I mean, they've been recruiting T. Higgins and Amari Rogers, and, they were in on James Robinson down in Florida for a while. They have every year a stacked board at wide receiver because it's such a popular school to go play receiver at. I mean, you're talking about Sammy Watkins, Nuke Hopkins, Martavis Bryant. I mean, even Jerron Brown, who we were all convinced was a safety, and at times with the way he played at Clemson, you kind of thought he should have been a safety, but he's in the NFL. I mean, they've done a great job of turning it around. And, what's funny is that position's gotten so much better now that Dabo Swinney is not coaching it. I think most Clemson fans will tell you that.
True.
Will tell you
That's very true.
So Jeff Scott's done a tremendous job. And so you take all those factors with what they're doing right now, and then you look and you see a kid, number one prospect in the state. He's a wide receiver. And you just sort of, you can't come off of that. And that's my thing. I know South Carolina feels good about him. I know South Carolina is working him very hard. I know South Carolina is recruiting him harder than Clemson is. But at the end of the day, I don't know that he's going to turn his back on an opportunity at Clemson. Now, so the question then becomes, do they just sort of want him? Do they really want him up at Clemson, or do they really not want him and they're just doing lip service and they're just going to let him go to Carolina? We hear that in recruiting all the time. Oh, we're just going to let him go to here or let him go to there. So, what's really going to happen with Ortre Smith and Clemson? And I think that's directly going to impact, what happens with South Carolina. I also think, September 11th is when he's going to decide. It would be helpful if South Carolina had some success the first 2 weeks of the season because Clemson will very likely be 2-0. If they can get past Auburn, and then I think they have Troy at home. So they'll be 2-0 most likely, and most likely in the top five. And, with as close as this is, it could play out in a number of different directions and things like that aren't really all that important when you're talking about the macro aspect of recruiting can be very important when you're talking about a final decision that happens within a small time span.
Well, I think it's going to boil down to this. Does Ortre Smith want to go to Clemson where he's probably going to win bigger earlier, but he's just going to be one of the guys, or is he going to come to South Carolina where he can basically from day one make an imprint on that football program and be a part of turning it around? And to me personally, I think if that's what it's going to boil down to. Does he want to be one of the guys that's maybe going to get 15, 20 catches a year, or does he want to be a guy that could get 60 catches a year?
Yeah, that's the question.
And so the Gamecocks had another big-time receiver in from the state of Georgia, Chad Terrell. Nobody's really talked much about him, but I remember he was on campus back in the spring, and I think I remember calling you and asking if A.J. Terrell and Chad Terrell were related, and I don't think they are, but this kid's another tall receiver sitting in the 6'2" range that runs really well, is a four-star player. looks like he came out of the weekend with South Carolina #1, and looks like he could be trending now. So where does he fit in exactly on the board with Ortre Smith, Justin Marshall, Chad Terrell, those guys? Is there a particular pecking order? Would the Gamecocks take all three? Would they take two or three? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, one thing I've learned is that with this staff, you just, you can't say for sure at the end of the day what's going to happen. If you look at how kind of recruiting came together at Florida when Will Muschamp was there, a lot of times their board / commit list or whatever would look different, way different in May and during the summer than it would down the stretch. That's how he got the reputation of the flipper and all that. They're always kind of adjusting it. My theory is right now is that there's a group of guys that they would like to take. They have to determine, with the mix of receivers that they currently have committed, and the receivers that they could get, who is the number one priority and what mix of guys are you going to get? We know Ortre Smith is a priority because he's the number one player in the state, and they're recruiting him very, very hard. Beyond that, there's a group of guys. Chad Terrell, Marshall is a guy you mentioned who's in the mix. You look at some of the other guys here, there, and yonder that they've offered. And I think that's the thing at receiver. I mean, after taking 5 last year and 6 if Evan Henson ends up playing receiver and sticking, which, could happen. It's a situation where, the numbers are going to, again, get a little tight, and I think they could very well take 4 or 5 this year just because they have to flip that position over, but they're going to have to be selective. And really, Terrell, to me, Keith, is the same guy as Justin Marshall, but Marshall's faster. And so, and I don't know if Brian McClendon agrees with me or not, but if I'm looking at it like that, I'm saying yes, definitely to Justin Marshall. And if things fall south with him or with Ortre, I think you go on Terrell pretty hard. But that's just my opinion. I don't know if they share it.
I got you. So one last guy that was at there was some drama surrounding whether he would be at the Spurs Inn event this weekend. Offensive tackle T.J. Moore from Charlotte, who I think we've been anticipating for 8 months that would be a Gamecock commitment. And every time he comes to campus, he is on the verge of committing, and then he doesn't commit. And so it's been several months since he's been on campus. He, has been wanting an Alabama offer, which, hey, if Alabama offered me today, I'd commit. So no problem understanding that. But now it looks like Alabama's not going to be an option. It looks like it's going to be down between South Carolina and Tennessee. I've watched his film, and I personally, of the 2 guys at Mallard Creek, Douglas and Moore's definitely an SEC offensive tackle. He's a guy that on film really jumps out with his athleticism, long arms. I think Douglas is more of a guard. How close do you think South Carolina is to finally, possibly, getting a commitment from T.J. Moore?
I think they're very close. I think they're in good shape. Even if Tennessee comes in and offers or firms up the offer, because Tennessee, they have a pretty big – they got a kid out of West Virginia as an offensive tackle. They have numbers situations too, just like anybody. Even if Tennessee says, hey, we want you, we love you, whatever, this is a recruiting battle South Carolina needs to win. I'm not going to say it's a must-win because no recruiting battles are really must-wins for one guy. But here's a guy that came to campus at South Carolina last summer as an unknown with no offers. South Carolina, Sean Elliott evaluated him, offered him, and he's been recruiting him hard ever since. This is a guy they have over a year-long relationship with that's had South Carolina as his lead for a long, long time. They've got his teammate committed. He's from Charlotte. You don't want to lose him to Tennessee. You don't want to lose him to your SEC East rival. And South Carolina, certainly, it's not good for the Gamecocks or anybody for Tennessee to recruit very, very well in the state of North Carolina. It's one of those territorial things. If you're the Gamecocks, you need to be the team that wins recruiting battles in North Carolina and not Tennessee. Unfortunately, Tennessee is the preseason SEC East favorite. They've been sort of building towards this year. They've had success on the recruiting trail in the state of North Carolina. They have a lot of momentum right now, and they have good people recruiting him. It's not – there's no shame in losing him to Tennessee, and that could be, a momentum shifter. But, at the end of the day, you've put in a year trying to recruit this guy. It would just be very tough from South Carolina's standpoint to lose him. Right now, I think they're getting him. But what happens in the next couple of weeks, that could obviously change things, and we'll see what ultimately happens. But, it would be a very big deal for South Carolina from a momentum and perception standpoint to get him and not allow him to go to Knoxville. Because if they lose him to Tennessee, that, like I said, it's not the end of the world. But that one, if you're South Carolina, would sting.
So, JC, sticking on that, if South Carolina lands more to go along with Douglas, how do you think that impacts the recruitment of the big-time receiver there, Ryan Jones, who's been to South Carolina 2 or 3 times but is currently committed to North Carolina?
I think South Carolina will have a shot with him. I just think it's got to be later in the process. You just have to keep him coming to campus. You also have to decide if you want him or not. Again, it gets back to the kind of cluster of guys at receiver and the different guys that they, could or could not take. So I think when you look at it, that's a guy that you just got to kind of keep on ice and keep working him, and see what happens at North Carolina this year, see what happens at South Carolina. There's a lot that could happen at both schools, over the course of the season that could, tip the scales towards him flipping or tip it towards him firming it up with North Carolina.
Interesting. Well, I guess we shall see. And, fall camp's just around the corner. The season's a little over a month away, and South Carolina needs to be good in September, JC. That's for sure. I think that would definitely continue the momentum in recruiting. If the Gamecocks put together a run here in recruiting and go on a run and land Jemias Williams, Brad Johnson, Fortrey Smith, MJ Webb, who was supposed to be at the cookout but had a death in the family. I think his uncle died. We've talked about him. They add Matthew Butler. They add T.J. Moore. All of a sudden you're looking at maybe a top 15 recruiting class for Will Muschamp in year. Well, I guess technically it'd be a second recruiting class, but his first full recruiting class.
Yeah, and then you have momentum coming out of that in 2018 where there are, maybe 9 or 10 prospects in South Carolina, 4 stars or better, probably 25 to 30 guys in state that are FBS level that we know of right now. That number is probably going to get about 40. The best year on record since 2009, which was a class that had Stephon Gilmore and Alshon Jeffrey, and I think Malachi Goodman was in that class as well. So there's,
and Devontae Holloman.
Yeah, Devontae Holloman. So that's kind of what you're looking at if you're South Carolina, and you could really, if you end this cycle well, 2018 could definitely go better and top 5 type. All right, let's switch gears to basketball. We're running out of time here on the Locked on the Gamecocks podcast. I'm JC Shurburtt along with Keith Allsep. First of all, the women's program, I know you follow them very closely. What do you make of the road schedule that Dawn Staley's put together? Yeah, I saw Texas, a game of Texas added, Duke on the road, Louisville on the road. She's really going to challenge this team this year, it seems.
At UConn as well.
And at UConn as well. How did I leave that one out?
I think that was wishful thinking, my friend. I think we'd all. But, we touched on last week, I really think this team potentially could be the most talented starting five Dawn Staley's had since she's been at South Carolina. I mean, she's really in strong position, and I think going on, into the NCAAs, to the region they went to last year, being far away from home. And so I guess, was it Sioux Falls or Sioux City?
Sioux Falls.
Yeah, Sioux Falls. I mean, wow. And then to be upset by Syracuse when you've been the number 2 team in the country all year, number 2 in the RPI, number 2 according to the NCAA seedings all year long, and they send you way out there and put Notre Dame and Lexington.
Yeah.
I think Coach Staley really wants to challenge this team and get them ready for the possibility of having to go to a Sioux Falls again. And no better way than to get tested on the road. And, I mean, these games are in addition to having to play at Texas A&M, at Kentucky, SEC road games. Yeah. And so it's a brutal schedule, but, maybe it's better for South Carolina, even if they come up on the short end a couple of these games, to gain that experience, because really in basketball, that's just like all the elite men's teams. They play tremendous non-conference schedule. I mean, North Carolina and Kentucky and Louisville and Kentucky, Michigan State and North Carolina, Michigan State and Duke. I mean, all these big-time cross-sectional November and December games before they get into conference play, and it really makes those teams, really tested and battle-tested for the NCAA tournament. And I think that's kind of the thought process for Coach Staley is, hey, to be the best, we got to beat the best, and this year we're just going to have to go on the road. Next year a lot of those games will be at home. So
yeah, I think so too. In basketball, it's sometimes good to be battle tested. I mean, we look and you look at the NCAA tournament, for example, in the men's side. 2 years ago, Kentucky didn't lose a game, right? And then they get upset by Wisconsin in the Final Four. Remember the UNLV team back in the early 90s, didn't lose a game. Then they go and they get upset in the Final Four against Duke. I think sometimes when you take a loss or two, you learn from it, and it doesn't make you play as tight once it gets to tournament time because you've been there and you're more focused. Speaking of the men, Rakeem Felder, big point guard. He's from Indian Land, South Carolina, and went and played high school ball up in New York City.
The winds of change kind of came on that one, because last week it was not looking good, for him to make it, and or at least we didn't think it looked that good for him to make it. And then late last week he gets a word that he's been officially accepted by the university, and I think that's a big get for South Carolina, because with Stroman transferring, I think he's a guy that can definitely provide some depth. He's a thick, left-handed, really, New York City type of point guard. He did spend some time in Indian Land and moved back to Brooklyn with his family, and is a guy that I think will, be a change-up type guy from P.J. Dozier off the bench, and a guy that Frank Martin is very high on, a very physical player, and a guy that can help the Gamecocks. That leaves one open scholarship for South Carolina. They had an official visitor, I guess it was a week ago on Sunday, a 6'9" junior college player from Australia named Rand Tut. I guess I don't know how long it'll take Gamecock Nation to start calling him King Tut if he commits. But he's a guy that I think South Carolina likes. Don't really know I think they've been waiting on the admission process. This is a guy that has some really good mid-major offers, but's been waiting on South Carolina, and it seems like JC, from just kind of reading the tea leaves, they're willing to go through the admissions process with him and see what happens. So that could be a late acquisition for Frank Martin, a guy to keep your eye on. But if you put a gun to my head and say pick today, I would probably say it's not going to happen, but as we all know, that definitely does not mean it won't happen.
Definitely. Ran Tut, 6'9", 210, came through Australia. Also, South Sudan is a guy that had a pretty good thing going at junior college. I mean, is one of those raw big men, very athletic player as well. All right, that's all the time we have for today on episode 2 of the Locked on the Gamecocks podcast. I'm JC Shurburtt, along with Keith Allsep. Keith, I enjoyed it today, buddy, and looking forward to talking next week.
Me too, JC. Again, check us out. Hopefully soon, Locked on the Gamecocks podcast will be available on iTunes. I think once we get into fall practice, and once some of these commitments start rolling, we'll have some rapid reaction podcasts. And so stay tuned for the latest episode of Locked on the Gamecocks.
All right, man. We'll talk to you soon, and we'll talk to all of you soon as well. Locked on the Gamecocks podcast, signing off.